This is the Earley AI Podcast, hosted by Seth Earley. Join us as we delve deep into the passions, expertise, and experiences of thought leaders and practitioners to talk about what's possible with artificial intelligence. The Earley AI Podcast is sponsored by Earley Information Science, your digital transformation journey with design and deployment of innovative technology solutions, as well as Vector. Now enjoy the show.
Well, welcome to today's Earley AI Podcast. I'm Seth Earley, your host, and today we're diving into how AI is changing the landscape of software development. With AI models advancing rapidly, the role of developers is shifting in big ways, and we'll break down what that means for the industry and what's really next. Our guest today is Yang Li. He's a leader in AI and software innovation. Yang has a strong track record in scaling startups and navigating complexities of AI technology. Currently, he's Chief Operating Officer at cutting-edge AI development firm Cosine. He's played a key role in everything from pioneering a micro-mobility IPO to driving major advancements in engineering software. His work focuses on leveraging AI to empower the next generation of developers. Yang, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Seth.
Let's start off with the big picture question. When you start thinking about AI and development, how is AI reshaping the role of software engineers today? We know that there's lots of different approaches for doing code generation. We know there's GitHub copilots and other types of tools. With AI shifting from hands-on coding to more strategic and architecture-driven approach, what do you see as the key elements of that transformation?
Yeah, I think that my view is that it's become quite a binary environment, right? So on the one hand, which is very publicly noticeable, developers are pushed towards become much more creative, to build, experiment much more, iterations much faster, build, whether it's brand new apps or software or even brand new features. This vibe coding phenomenon has pushed developers to become much more creative. They become the ideas person, so they have every skill set and no excuse now to not become the pioneers of new ideas. On the other side, I think what is less talked about is also the vast quantities of backlog tasks, right? Any organization that has software more than a couple of years old with more than 1 million or 2 lines has a huge backlog of whether it's bugs that are non-critical, features that are important to some customers, but probably not enough to divert the entire engineering team towards, or even just nice to have, like these ideas that are more rounded, but just require more engineering effort to do, but are sitting on a backlog. I think that is now the next frontier where people are focusing on to say, it's fun and it's useful to have greenfield projects and vibe code your way through that. But what do we do now in terms of the backlog that we've had maybe years, if not decades of?
Yeah. So that's really super important. And I know there's some organizations, there was an insurance company we worked with years ago that had, of course they still have COBOL, right? And they had so many systems and processes and just such complexities that trying to innovate was really a nightmare for them. And that legacy code base that they had was just insurmountable in terms of trying to modernize that. So I imagine that that's certainly going to be true for some organizations. How do you really see that being addressed in this AI-driven software engineering environment and landscape?
Yeah, I think it's a question or a problem that we were posed quite early on. When we started Cosine, we of course were doe-eyed and idealistic and thought, in a few weeks we could create a solution that every investment bank and insurance company under the sun would use. And, quite frankly, we were put in our place very early on. An example from our side is that we spoke to a bulge bracket investment bank that flew us out. We presented to the managing directors, and they just asked us point blank, "How are you going to help us, make PRs, and ship new code in COBOL, in Haskell, in assembly?" To a certain extent, a lot of these languages are no longer taught. Like no college student is learning, COBOL or Fortran anymore. So what do we do?
And there's not a lot of training examples out there, I would imagine.
Exactly, right. And even if there are training examples, they're not open source. They're private repos inside these enterprises that they would never let you have access to. And so that's fundamentally a lot of these important and out of distribution sort of examples are not trained inside LLMs, no matter what model you use, whether you train your own, whether you use an open source or a closed source, OpenAI, Anthropic, a meta model, it's just out of distribution. So what can you do about it, right? So we took the perspective of you only have two options in our view, right? You have some players in this space who are doing agentic software engineers like we are. You kind of brute force it. You rely on inference time compute. You throw as many solutions as possibly humanly or even a GPU possibly that you can generate. So you're somewhat throwing spaghetti at the wall, hoping that one of these solutions will work. And in an infinite time frame with enough compute, I think it is possible, but it's probably not very probable that you'll land on something that adheres to, Fortran code that was written in 1971. I think that's the problem, and that's what we always wanted to focus on as an organization. We knew that there were lots of players and competitive space in the Greenfield project, in a modern code base, whether it's TypeScript or JavaScript. But what we wanted to do was, well, how do you train AI to be good at legacy code bases, coding languages that have fewer examples? Well, we fundamentally said, well, how does a human do so, right? So we thought, well, if you are a human, if you were dumped inside a code base you were unfamiliar with, and if you're looking at a language that you haven't learned fully, you would rely on two things. One is that you would kind of browse, right? You would gather information, you would open some files, you would read documentation, you would, to some extent, you would look at comments that have been left by other developers in the past. And on the other side, you would rely upon your other knowledge to generalize across, right? So you would look at other languages that you would be familiar with to do so. And so that's what we did. Uniquely have generated a synthetic data set. And this is from day one we've always done that mimics how a human would reason and navigate a code base and do, coding tasks, right? So what we did is that we essentially are able to generate that data set that teaches or shows the AI how exactly for types of tasks, what files you would open, what are the steps you would take next, so that there is some sort of semblance, and I'm not claiming that we've instilled reasoning inside AI model, but it's some sort of mimicry of reasoning. And so what that allows us to do is that our product and our AI model that powers it is able to take an unfamiliar code base, an unfamiliar task, and kind of work through it and generate much more signal, right, so that it can become much better at doing these tasks.
So that's interesting. And how well has that worked in practice? Have you been able to tackle some revamping and redeployment of that type of legacy software?
Yeah, so I think that there is two data points to point out here. One is, of course, everyone in this industry cares about benchmarks. And our latest benchmark is we ran Lancer, which is an OpenAI released coding agent benchmark, which is they took $1 million worth of real developer tasks on Upwork. So these are real bounties that someone was willing to pay for and then completed by a freelancer. And then they pit essentially AI coding agents up across those $1 million of tasks. We scored, we essentially scored 49% across the benchmark. And that is significantly higher. And don't quote me on this, please double check this. My belief is like, so if you look at OpenAI's GPT-4, they were at 8%, and O1 was at 16%. Right. So it is a significant jump in terms of its ability to solve problems of real developer tasks. We hope, right? And no benchmark is perfect. There's always room for benchmarks. But it is a cross-section of a real developer task across the spectrum. Yeah. I was saying, like, and I think even, the second data point is that, we now do have since we last connected, we do have a publicly available product now everyone can access. And one of the larger enterprises that we deployed at is a large, bulge bracket investment bank that is specifically asking us to tackle the problems that their engineers cannot do, right? And I can't promise you what the long-term aspect is because we've just launched a week ago. But early on, it's very promising in terms of just even if you are super skeptical and say, I don't believe in agentic software engineers yet, we have seen that time to get a human engineer up to speed on a language or a repo that they are not familiar with has decreased dramatically, where we're talking orders of magnitude faster.
Interesting. So it's essentially helping the engineer be able to tackle these problems. Now, you said they were not able to tackle the problems. What was the big obstacle when you said their engineers couldn't do some of these things? Was it just
Yeah.
lack of experience and fluency in the languages because they're so archaic? Was it the level of complexity of the different systems and tools? What was the a big obstacle?
Yeah, I think that I can't say for certain, but at least from the data that I have seen, my gut feel is that the vast majority is from bad prompts, right? So there's essentially a couple of ways that you can use our product Genie. You can just type it into a chat box, give it a prompt. You can copy and paste a ticket from Linear. You can do a direct integration. So you can assign the Linear task or Jira task, or you can send it from Slack. When the prompt or the ticket is detailed enough, then our agent is much more capable. It's usually the lack of information that is problematic, right? So for a human, you can be much more flexible in terms of being vague. And, if you said something like,
Ambiguous.
ambiguous, you say, fix the bugs on the front end. That maybe because you've spoken to a colleague at a water cooler, you would understand that. But for an agent, because you don't have that context, it just doesn't work. So if you can overcome that problem, the next problem we have is, and I don't think this is unique to us, I think this is a lot of coding agents are the same, is that if the task is too large or too big, right, it essentially it kind of loses its way. I'd say it's not to humanize it too much. It almost gets distracted. And so what we are about to release next week is a new feature called Auto PM. So, it's an auto project manager. We see it as our version of deep research as like an OpenAI trend, where it can ask further questions. It essentially puts itself into a loop, and it can go for hours, right? We've given it tasks where it has come back 3 hours later and successfully deployed, a huge change, right? Where there is like tens of thousands of lines of differences. And I think for us that's the next step, what we're trying to fix. There's always a limit of what we think that, as as you think you fix somewhere, there's always a new leak that appears somewhere else. But I think we are moving towards both user education becoming better, but also a product becoming better, much more truly agentic, right? I saw something on X the other day. It's like, you can't really claim your AI tool is agentic unless it basically, when you have to prompt it multiple times for the same task. And I think we probably agree, right? Hopefully our next update will decrease that, but we're not truly agentic fully until we get to the point where it's completely autonomous by itself.
Well, I guess I would not completely agree with that. I would think that you still have to give course corrections, or you still have to give ongoing instructions and prompts and so on. But I understand the point. Yeah. I'm not sure I would agree with it completely. I think you could still be agentic and still have some interventions. Anyway, I don't want to argue that point. But my question, let me rephrase my question a little bit because when you first mentioned this, you said this large investment bank was asking you to solve problems that their engineers could not solve. And so can you talk more about what was holding the engineers back? So how did you fill that gap? What was the specific capability that he did not have? Or what was the reason? Was it simply a matter of bandwidth? Was it simply skill set? Was it complexity? What were the things that were stopping the engineers from being able to solve those problems?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different categories, but you're absolutely right with the first one. Number one is just bandwidth. A lot of these times the engineers do not have the capacity to get to it. Like when we talked about the backlog, these backlogs sometimes decade long, if not more. What they simply do is that they assign every task to our agent. And speaking very candidly, some tasks we only return a result that is 25% useful. Other times we return something that is 99% useful. But it is still better than zero. And what they do is that, again, the feedback we've gotten is, even if it doesn't completely get it right, it's much easier for an engineer to critique the work than it is for them to start on a blank sheet of paper and have no context. And so they are able to work asynchronously, and even to the extent where they still do not assign any engineers fully to this backlog. What they do is to say, well, the human engineers, you're assigned for this sprint, you still have your own tickets that you have to prioritize. But in your downtime, or asynchronously, take a preview or take a peek at what a Genie has returned. And if it takes, one or two prompts, or it takes, and we essentially allow the developer to have the same, code editor that Genie has access to. So you could just literally dive in and change a few lines of code. If that is all it takes to ship the PR, and what Genie does is it runs your CI fully, right? So you have some level of confidence already that the PR shipping will work if it passes your CI. It allows them to basically juggle and multitask much more effectively. So that's the first category. The second category is I also see a lot of problems, particularly with legacy code bases, which is simply size of code base. No engineer can memorize a million lines of code and how it works and interoperates and all that stuff. And it's simply, whether it's a new engineer or an experienced engineer, it's allowing them to essentially to say, okay, I now have some idea where to go. And even if the agent is completely wrong, it started my thinking and towards that direction. And it's this essentially to solve the cold start problem, right? I think non-engineers or people who haven't done software engineering before view it as, the engineer sits down, immediately starts writing code as if it's in a Hollywood movie. And then at the end of the day, they ship something and it works magically. Probably, I think most engineers would agree, the vast majority of your time is thinking and researching and navigating, and that for what we do is that we eliminate that cold start problem, and sometimes 100% of the time, and sometimes 20% of the time, right? And then that doesn't matter. And the very last category, I think, for us, that is surprising, right? And maybe this is not fully surprising. Not surprising inside an IDE. I think that it's become the norm for people to use AI-enabled IDE like Cursor or Windsurf, and but that's on device, right? So someone you can't really do asynchronously, and if you wanted to, a lot of times, if you wanted to access your terminal and do commands, you have to be present to allow it. Asynchronously on an agent, we have found that it's almost a creativity problem that we're solving. But when an engineer is given a vague task to say, improve conversion or improve loading speed, right? We have seen people do the same task concurrently in multiple instances. So the same ticket is prompted slightly differently 20 different times. And then the engineer then comes back, let's say 30 minutes later, and then they see which one has promise. So it's A/B testing on a massive scale, where they couldn't think of every single idea. They then tested every single idea, and then they essentially eliminate the ones that are not working very aggressively. And that is something that we've seen a lot of the larger organizations that we do, because obviously the larger organizations have lots of voices and lots of great ideas, but how do you filter down to the right idea? Well, data or performance speaks for itself, right? So why not try it? And to enable people to do it asynchronously, multiple instances at the same time concurrently, is something that is only achievable if you have an agent and not inside your IDE, right? And also for us, the way that our pricing works, right? And people can go on our website and look at pricing ourselves, so we'll promote ourselves here. But it's flat, right? So I think for us, it's like people are now increasingly worried about using AI-enabled IDEs and the price. Yes, there is a fixed monthly subscription, but then the number of tokens or computing units that you have is suddenly going to skyrocket if you really rely on it. And efficiency increases, but so does your cost. I think that it's not as linear as people think, which is efficiency increases and then cost decreases. A lot of organizations have not seen the cost decrease. They've actually seen their cost increase, despite the productivity increase that they're having.
Right. I mean, I almost think that generative AI slows me down, right? Because I will start with my materials. I never ask it questions without context. It has all of my content. It has articles. It has my tone and voice and all of that. But then when I start processing my ideas, I have too many options, right? I have to go through different iterations. And so I agree, the more possibilities there are, the more bandwidth it requires to evaluate those. So hopefully that'll improve. Now, one of the things that we talked about in the earlier prep call were benchmarks, and how you mentioned at the time that you did really well on a benchmark, and maybe you could talk about that benchmark. But then you said, but the product was still lacking from your perspective. And you want to talk a little bit about benchmarks versus real world product capabilities, and then what you found, what was that disparity?
Yeah, no, I think this was last summer when we ran SWE Verified, right, which is another coding agent benchmark that is industry standard. At that time, we were the highest score in the world. We haven't since run it. And I think that it's quite indicative why we haven't rerun it, because we didn't think it was particularly useful anymore to help us build a product. But we still represent the largest jump in score in its history.
That's impressive.
Yeah,
I think with that, you can't argue with that data, right?
We can't, and I think, and again, don't quote me on this. I think we are also one of the few people, if not the only people in the world still, that has run every single task on SweBench and SweBench Verified. It's just actually, it's an incredible hard benchmark to get up and running. And The problem is with SweetBench is that at the time we blindly accepted, because everyone else loved it, then if we beat it, then obviously our product will be great. In hindsight, it was only Python, right? And then it was only about bug fixes. Engineers across the world don't just use Python to fix bugs. They do such a wide variety of things. And we actually soft launched that product to a small cohort of, we had tens of thousands of people on our waitlist, and we let a few like sort of select users, and got some smaller ones, some larger ones on it to try it. But it just kept on not working, right? And it was because it was such a disparity, was to say we had such a great benchmark result, but in the real world it wasn't working. And there was a couple of things that wasn't working. Number one is that the product itself just wasn't conducive in supporting how to work with an agentic AI coding agent, right? At that time, our product was, even if Genie got it 99.99% right, there was no way for you to make small changes with a code editor. And you would have to reprompt it and hope for the best, and hopefully it came out again. And that was non-deterministic. And we were just too naive, thinking that, of course, it would work and you could just re-roll the dice. But that just wasn't the case. And I think the second point that we found was that, we actually found that it's not just one benchmark. We actually had to create, from the difference between last year and this year, is that we now have a plethora of internal benchmarks that are not public, right? We use the full candor here. We do use the public benchmarks as some sort of PR and some to promote ourselves, and it's generally accepted and people get very excited about it. And it's part of the portfolio that we use to do. But a lot of the times now we do is we have to create benchmarks in areas where there is no coverage on public benchmarks, right? So, for example, what about a code base, or what about a project that uses multiple languages at the same time, right? Or what about, using libraries that are severely outdated, right? Instead of just the most up-to-date libraries? And that to us is actually the biggest learning, is that we now have a dedicated team just to build internal evals doing that. And for us, then, this is I guess a little bit of, I don't know, my team behind me is going to kill me for saying this out loud, but we are very advanced in supervised fine tuning, and this is what a current product uses. But of course, like everyone else, and there's an MIT tech review article about us and Poolside, both tackling the next frontier, which is reinforcement learning with code execution. Creating our own evals and reward functions is how you win the next frontier, or doing reinforcement learning sort of techniques. And for us, we're already seeing for Genie 3, our next model, huge leaps in sort of performance, just simply by having really great sort of internal evals that other people don't have. And I do think that that's what's going to make or break a startup in the future, about creating these coding agent models.
Interesting. That's interesting. So one of the things that we had talked about is the danger of, over-reliance on some of these tools, just like we see, marketing organizations, offload too much of their stuff to a Gen AI application, and then their campaigns kind of sound like everybody else, and they don't have as much differentiation. I like to say, standardization, when you're doing stuff that other people are doing, will give you some efficiency, but differentiation gives you competitive advantage, right? And now in the coding world, of course, you are always differentiating because you have very unique problems to solve. But is there still a potential, or is there over-reliance? Are people potentially getting lazy in terms of depending upon these tools, or offloading too much of these tools? And if so, what's the implication of that?
Yeah, I think there are, from talking to our customers, I think there are probably 2 points that I would mention. One is, I don't think that there is an over-reliance just yet, right? There may come a time where we do everything and nothing is done by humans anymore. But so far, at least specifically for our unique quality of being able to tackle complex legacy code bases and large backlogs, the backlogs are huge, right? There is a lot of backlog tickets to churn through before people start running out of things to do. And these were untouched before. The second point I would say is, we found a unique perspective from actually an HR executive. So we were talking to a large enterprise about deploying our solution on premises, which we actually managed to engineer a solution for. And we are cloud native, and our main public product is a cloud product. But for this customer, we built an on-prem solution. The HR director or the SVP of HR essentially asked, how do we promote people if everyone's skill set is at parity? Right? When a junior engineer is doing the same work and the output as a senior engineer, what does a career ladder look like? So I wouldn't necessarily call it lazy, right? So we didn't call people lazy, from using better IDEs or better computers. It's just a shift in technology and becoming more efficient. Maybe I'm a tech optimist here, but I do think there are some consequences in terms of how do you assess, right? Laziness is one factor, competency is another. How do you assess the promotion track? And prompt engineering may be it, right? So the effectiveness of writing prompts is where you assess someone, or maybe you just look at sheer output, right? Does it work? And what is a binary outcome? Does it work? And how many PRs did they merge? How many PRs they shipped were merged in the end into the code base?
Interesting. So I was listening to an article on one of a podcast someplace, and they were talking about how organizations are trying to test people, for employment, and obviously one of the ways of doing that is with task-based assessments. And then the question is, do you let people use AI tools or do you not let them use AI tools when they, in fact, will be using them in their work, right? So it was kind of an interesting dilemma. And there was some discussion about how people are addressing that and getting around that. But I think your point around evaluation is very important. What are the results and what are the outcomes? So, when you think about the ability to handle autonomous development of very complex software, there's some really great thinking here that you've shared. But what are the biggest misconceptions that you're seeing in the marketplace? What are people not understanding about AI assisted or AI generated software engineering? What are the misconceptions? What are people missing?
I think the first one is, in general, and maybe I shouldn't be doing it because I am in the industry. I think in general, coding agents are overhyped. I think that there is an expectation and of being able to do tasks end to end fully, any task, anywhere, any code base. We're not quite there yet, right? I think that there is no player, whether you are, well funded or, lots of great talent, whether you are Cognition and Devon, whether you are, Poolside, whatever you may be. I don't believe anyone is there, right? And I think that what the problem is that even though everyone claims to be a generalist coding agent, you do actually drill down to it. There is a niche that people are kind of dominating, right? So I may be misrepresenting my competitors and fellow startup people, but Cursor and Windsurf, Replit, right? We count Amjad Masad as an investor, are great at brand new projects. But we do think we are much more competitive. We are lighter, we are faster, we are more capable at legacy backlog tasks that no engineer ever wants to be assigned to. Maybe with time it will converge and we will become generally better as the underlying models become better as well. But I think for now, the misconception is it's not fully capable. You have to drill down and be honest and say you're better at specific things. We can, right? If you go on to our website now and sign up, you get a free trials, right? So everyone can sign up and to try it out, and you don't mind. If people don't like it, you can cancel. But you can ask it to do a Genie to do a brand new project, right? So make a Tetris clone, make me a data visualization website. You can do it. I just don't think that we are the best tool for that. And I think there are plenty of other tools that are better.
So interesting. You talked about vibe coding earlier. And what is your definition of vibe coding? And what do you think that means in the marketplace? And I imagine there's everything from, it reminds me of the days of Lotus Notes of all things back in the 80s when people were sending their administrative assistants to application development classes, which I was teaching, saying anybody can do this, right? Anybody can build the Notes application. And then you saw what it meant when administrative assistants built, Notes forms and so on. But tell me what your thoughts are about vibe coding, and then what does it really mean in your world? And then what does you think it means in the bigger picture?
Yeah,
where did that name come from?
I think for me, and maybe my pause here gives you everything you need in terms of, I think it's a fuzzy definition, and I definitely bend the definition depending on the conversation I'm having here. But I think in general, I think that it is a seamless way for someone to get to turn their idea into something that is presentable to share with someone else. It doesn't always have to work, and it definitely isn't seamless. And you've seen lots of horror stories now on X where there's security vulnerabilities. There is the fact that after a certain point it's not scalable anymore, and they have to rebuild it with a huge engineer. I think those problems will solve itself with time, right? Everyone's improving their product, and models are improving. But I think what it is for me, what vibe coding is where previously you had to use words and language to describe your idea, you can now show people your idea, right? And that time between you having thought of an idea to actually being able to show people an idea has now reduced almost to zero because of vibe coding. And I think to some extent, I agree. It has democratized. In our team, we have people who are non-technical, people who haven't learned to code. And part of the Friday demo sessions that we have, we have if we have some pizzas and we have some beers for everyone, we ask the non-technical people to build us a demo, right? Whatever feature, whatever new idea they want, they have to prompt it their way. We help them obviously set them up with something like Vercel so that we can deploy and actually see it. But we want to see that side. And actually, I would say a lot of the time, maybe more than half of the time, the best idea that came out from that session is a non-technical person because they have a different perspective. Whereas previously they could not possibly code that up.
Right. And what kinds of ideas are people coming up with? And just out of curiosity, like what would a vibe coding output be for a non-technical person in your organization?
Yeah, so I can come up with two ideas, right? So we essentially had an idea which was sort of like an abandoned checkout idea. So when you see a new customer go through the funnel and at some point they fall out. So instead of emailing them and doing traditional mode, you can see certain behavior within the product already that you instantly insert let's say a coupon or give them an offer or prompt them with a certain pop-up or maybe something to nudge them in the right direction where it was based on data so that you've gathered so far through the funnel or people who are similar cohorts, right? And that was an idea from a marketer where you couldn't, we probably an engineer may not have thought about that because they're not focused on it. And the way that they did it was to say, well, we wanted to build essentially, essentially a small app that was running internally that captured these data points and read it from somewhere like PostHog, where when it caught that behavior and put them into a cohort, you would instantly give them an offer that you thought was pricing for them. And another idea that came up was essentially, based on, again, if we found, certain behaviors or demographics to say, well, they may be more inclined to work on a project that is on a certain code base or coding language, or they're from a certain region where we say, okay, they're probably learning the language for the first time, so JavaScript, TypeScript, maybe a more modern language. We kind of shift that again towards the copy might change as they are going through the. Just really great ideas that we could action and genuinely will make an impact to our business.
Right. No, that's great. And I totally see your point of giving those tools and capabilities to people who normally would not have them, but they still have great ideas and they can explore those ideas in a meaningful way. So before we wrap up, when you look back at your career and your work across different sectors, what advice would you give to developers and technology professionals who are trying to make an impact in 2025 and beyond? What kind of advice would you give people? Sometimes I say, if you could go back to yourself after you graduated college, what would you say? That's one way to think about it. But generally speaking, what guidance, because things are changing so rapidly. And it's also kind of asked the question of where the future careers will be and so on. But what kind of advice would you give people?
Yeah, I think, again, speaking very candidly, I always hesitate to give advice because I still don't feel like I know what I'm doing either.
You're figuring it out, as we all are.
I'm figuring it out as I go, and I feel like if I repeated my life again, if there was a true controlled experiment, I'm not sure I would get the same result again. So I always hesitant because I always think there is a little bit of romanticizing from people who achieved any success to retrospectively, apply logic to say, well, I was successful because I did this. But I think I would encourage, and this is not unique, my younger self to be not afraid to take risks. And I suppose I would frame that as in, you kind of only need the dice to land on 6 once. There is you just need to go and do it, right? Whatever thing that you have an inkling for, whatever that you feel like this could work out or could not work out, particularly if you are young and you just graduated, you don't have kids, you don't have a mortgage, you don't have that, just go do it. Because yes, you may fail and you might be embarrassed, but actually if you just strike it lucky, I've been very fortunate to have encountered and worked with and exited with lots of successful entrepreneurs. I think if you got them to speak candidly, they would say they worked hard, they are smart, but actually they got lucky. And that luck came from the fact that they actually did something, right? This idea of the bias towards action, of just go and do it.
Right. That's a great point. And, if you don't roll the dice, you're not going to get sixes, right? So you have to take those risks and you have to take those chances. And you're right, early in your career, you can do that. Well, thank you so much, Yang, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts and your insights. I really appreciate it. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. And of course, stay with us for more conversations about AI and how things are evolving. Also want to thank Carolyn Southwick for her help in putting the show together. But again, Yang, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me as well, Seth.
Thank you for joining us on another deep dive into AI innovation. Tune in next time when we introduce another industry expert and discuss how to maximize AI in your world. The Earley AI Podcast is sponsored by Earley Information Science and Vector. To learn more, visit earley.com. That's EARLEY.com. Thank you for tuning in.